So we've been talking about the irrepressibility of the Holy Spirit. We've looked at the first three examples here. And for many of you, as I mentioned before, you could probably think that some of these could cross over into a different category, and that's okay. I don't have any problem necessarily with a little ebbing and flowing, but this is the way I set it up. This is what I saw and how it made sense to me. So we've looked at so far the irrepressibility of the Holy Spirit over natural barriers such as languages and storms. We've looked at the irrepressibility of the Spirit over physical barriers, sickness and lameness, over jail and geographical distances. Now, I don't know if I mentioned that before with the physical barriers, but the example is chapter 16, verses 6 and 7. The reason that the apostles didn't go into a specific region to preach the gospel is because the Holy Spirit told them to wait. The third example is the irrepressibility of the Spirit over supernatural barriers. And so we saw there the devil was an example, Simon the magician, sons of Sceva, and idolatry. And then now number four, the irrepressibility of the Spirit over religious differences. And so there are five examples here that I draw your attention to. The first is Jews at Antioch and Iconium, chapter 13, verse 50, chapter 14, verse 19. That's where they try to stone Paul, and in verse 20 he rises again, and then in verse 21 he goes and continues to preach. So talk about an example there of the Holy Spirit being irrepressible. You can't repress, you can't hold down the Spirit, even if that person is being stoned to death. God's work is His work, and He can do these great things through people at seemingly incredible odds. So the second example of the irrepressibility of the Spirit over religious differences is Caesar and Rome. You're going to see St. Paul struggle with that a lot. Number three is the Pharisees and Sadducees. Of course, Jesus is a person who struggled with their opposition on a regular basis. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 4, 1 to 3, chapter 5, verse 18 and 19, and chapter 7, verse 51. Number four is sorcerers. Elymas the magician in chapter 16, verses 16 to 18, or even chapter 13, 6 to 11. So you can see this obstacle, and yet the Holy Spirit and His work is continuing. And then number five, the synagogue of the freedmen. And again, this is a little bit of an unknown passage, but if you look at that, chapter 6, verses 9 to 14, and the instigation to try to have false witness towards the apostles and all of that. These things, for all intents and purposes, seem like great odds and obstacles, inabilities, for people to move forward and preach the gospel. I mean, you're being opposed at every, kind of front. So it would seem like you couldn't do it. And yet the work of the Spirit in these apostles, the early church, it continues because of the work of that Spirit. And number five, the irrepressibility of the Spirit over internal differences. And there are 4 points here. Internal differences. The first is Paul, Luke, Barnabas, and Mark. They had some difficulty in their missionary journeys. At some time, you're going to see that they don't want people to come with them. So it's a very interesting dynamic. It's internal fighting, and you would think in some ways that could stop everything cold, and yet the Spirit of God works uniquely in each of them. You look at the struggle with the Greek inclusion. Should the Greeks be allowed into this work of the Spirit? And of course we have Peter and Cornelius, and the work of the Spirit. Don't call unclean what I've made clean. You can look at of course the message of salvation that is given by both Peter and by Paul, and how it's a message that reaches out to the other nations. The irrepressibility of the Spirit over internal differences. Number three is the Council of Jerusalem, and that's in chapter 4, verse 15. As the council convenes, they're going to answer some questions about dietary laws, about ceremonial things like circumcision. These are very important parts of the Jewish heritage and customs. So do Jews, are they necessarily required to implement that to the Gentiles coming into the church? And so we see some answers that are given at the Council of Jerusalem from the leadership there, James and Peter, to be able to articulate what the church is going to ask of these people coming in. The irrepressibility of the Spirit over internal differences. Ananias and Sapphira, of course, is the great example. Chapter 5, verses 3 to 10. They both sell property. They bring the money to the apostles, and then they lie about the amount of money and what was sold and all that. And they both are struck dead, and a great kind of fear, a holy fear, enters into that church. And so ultimately, when you look at the work of the Spirit and you read through the Isaiah lists and the Galatians, and you see the fruit of the Spirit, and you begin to recognize that the work of the Spirit in the church to help the church to grow, all of this is here. The story begins, of course, for us there from the side of Christ. His side is pierced, blood and water pour out, the church is born, the descent of the Spirit empowering and filling the church to go out, and that same Spirit that worked in Jesus Christ is now working in the early church, and we today are the culmination of that story, and hopefully the way that we live our life will be in step with what's happened before, and we will be, hopefully a fitting witness for the work of God, the Spirit of God in our life for generations to come.